They were told the end had come. When American guards appeared at the barracks door in March 1946 and ordered the German women to assemble in the courtyard, whispers turned to panic. Some clutched photographs of families they would never see again. Others said silent prayers, their lips trembling in the cold morning air. They expected rifles, blindfolds, perhaps a final march to some hidden field. But when the trucks arrived at Camp Como in Mississippi, what emerged were not weapons but white fabric, delicate lace, and boxes marked with New York department store labels. The guards were bringing wedding dresses, not death, but celebration. The women stood frozen, unable to process the contradiction. One prisoner later wrote in her diary, "We prepared for execution and received silk instead." How do you reconcile that? If you want to hear more incredible true stories from World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The war in Europe had ended 9 months earlier, but for hundreds of German women held in American prison camps across the southern United States, time moved differently. Camp Como, nestled in the pine forests of northern Mississippi, was one of several facilities housing female prisoners of war. These were not soldiers, but women who had served in auxiliary roles for the Wehrmacht. Radio operators, nurses, secretaries, telephone switchboard workers. Women who had typed orders, bandaged wounds, transmitted coded messages, and kept the machinery of war functioning from behind the lines. They arrived in the autumn of 1945, transported by ship and train from the ruins of Germany to the strange abundance of America. The journey itself had been disorienting. They sailed past the Statue of Liberty, watching New York's untouched skyline rise before them while memories of Berlin's rubble haunted their thoughts. They rode through American towns where children played on green lawns and grocery stores displayed food in quantities they had not seen in years. Camp Como was surrounded by tall wire fences topped with coils of barbed wire, but the barracks were clean, painted white, and arranged in neat rows. Guard towers stood at each corner, though the soldiers in them seemed more bored than vigilant. The buildings had heat. The beds had mattresses. These were luxuries the women had not expected from captivity. Inside the camp, the women adjusted to a daily routine that felt surreal. Each morning began with a bell at 6 o'clock. They lined up for breakfast in a mess hall that smelled of coffee, real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they had drunk in Germany. The food was simple but abundant. Oatmeal with sugar, toast with butter, sometimes eggs or bacon. The women ate slowly at first, half expecting the generosity to end, half guilty about the abundance when their families back home were starving. The sounds of the camp were American. Country music drifted from the guards' radio at night. Trucks rumbled past on distant highways. Birdsong filled the pine trees, cheerful and indifferent to the war that had brought these women here. Sometimes the guards spoke to them in broken German, trying to be friendly. Other times they simply watched in silence, uncertain how to treat women who were technically enemies but clearly posed no threat. The women worked light duties. Some helped in the camp kitchen. Others did laundry or mended uniforms. A few with nursing experience assisted in the camp infirmary. The work was not hard, and they were paid small amounts in camp currency that could be used at the canteen to buy chocolate, cigarettes, soap, even magazines. It was strange to hold an American dollar, even a fake one, and exchange it for luxuries that would have been unimaginable in wartime Germany. Yet beneath the surface calm, fear simmered. The women had been told by Nazi propaganda that Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture and degradation. When those predictions did not come true, when they were given beds and meals instead of beatings and starvation, confusion replaced terror. What were the Americans planning? Why treat prisoners so well? Some women suspected it was a trick, that the kindness would end and punishment would follow. Among them was Greta, a 24-year-old who had worked as a telegraph operator for the Luftwaffe. She kept a small diary hidden under her mattress, writing by candlelight after the others had fallen asleep. In one entry from December 1945, she wrote, "We are prisoners, but we are treated better here than we were as free women in Berlin during the war. I do not understand America. I do not understand why our leaders lied to us. Every kindness here feels like an accusation. Letters from home arrived sporadically, censored but heartbreaking. Families wrote of living in cellars beneath bombed-out buildings. They described children with hollow cheeks and old people dying from cold and hunger. One woman received a letter from her mother that simply said, 'We have nothing. If you can send anything, please do.' But the prisoners could send nothing except words. The gulf between their relative comfort and their family's suffering was unbearable. Then in the early spring of 1946, something changed. Rumors began to spread through the camp. The guards were planning something. Supplies had been arriving in unmarked trucks. The camp commander had called a meeting with his staff that lasted for hours. The women whispered at night in their bunks, trying to guess what was coming. Some feared deportation to worse camps. Others worried about trials and punishment for their roles in the war. A few even whispered the unthinkable, that the Americans might be planning executions. On a cold morning in March, the guards came before breakfast. They moved through the barracks quickly, waking the women and ordering them to dress and assemble in the central courtyard. There was no explanation, only urgency. The women pulled on their plain work dresses and coats, their hands shaking as they laced their boots. Some grabbed their few possessions, certain they were being moved. Others left everything behind, too frightened to think clearly. In the courtyard, they stood in ragged lines, breath fogging in the morning air. The guards counted them, checked their names against lists. The camp commander appeared, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern face that gave nothing away. He looked at the assembled women for a long moment without speaking. Some of the women began to cry silently. Others held hands, seeking comfort and touch. Greta stood near the back, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The commander cleared his throat and spoke in careful German, each word pronounced slowly. "Ladies," he said, and the word itself was startling. "Not prisoners, not enemy. Ladies. You have been here for several months. You have worked hard. You have followed the rules. Today we have something for you. Something to celebrate." Celebrate? The word made no sense. What was there to celebrate in a prison camp? What could prisoners celebrate with their captors? The women looked at each other, confused and wary. Then the trucks arrived. 3 large trucks pulled through the camp gates and stopped near the assembly. The guards opened the back panels, and for a moment nothing happened. Then American soldiers began unloading boxes. Large boxes, medium boxes, small parcels wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The boxes were marked with names the women recognized from American magazines they had seen in the canteen. Macy's, Gimbel's, Lord & Taylor, department stores, fancy stores. Why would a prison camp be receiving deliveries from New York department stores? The commander signaled, and the guards began opening the boxes. What emerged made the women gasp. Dresses. Beautiful dresses. Not the plain cotton work dresses they wore every day, but elegant gowns made of silk, satin, taffeta, and lace. Evening dresses in deep blues and emerald greens. Cocktail dresses with delicate beading. And in the largest boxes, pulled out carefully and held up for all to see, were wedding dresses. White gowns with long trains, veils of fine netting, dresses that looked like they belonged in fairy tales, not prison camps. The women stood frozen. Several had covered their mouths with their hands, others had tears streaming down their faces. One woman near the front collapsed to her knees, overcome by emotion she could not name. Greta felt her legs weaken. She had been prepared for death. She had been certain the assembly meant execution or deportation to some terrible place. Instead, there were dresses, wedding dresses, evening gowns, gifts. The commander spoke again, his voice gentle now. These dresses have been donated by American women. Church groups, community organizations, individuals who wanted you to have them. We know some of you were married before the war. Some of you were engaged to men who did not return. Some of you may marry in the future. These dresses are yours. You may keep them, alter them, wear them. They are a gift. A gift. From Americans. To German prisoners. The contradiction was overwhelming. Why would Americans give them anything? Why would enemy women send wedding dresses to enemy women? It made no sense within the framework of war, of us and them, of victors and defeated. And yet here were the dresses, real and undeniable, hanging from the guards' hands like flags of peace. What followed was chaos of emotion. Some women laughed, high and hysterical. Others sobbed openly, their shoulders shaking with the force of their tears. A few simply stared, unable to process what they were seeing. The guards stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond to this outpouring of feeling. They had expected gratitude, perhaps, but this was something deeper and more complicated. This was grief and relief and confusion and joy all tangled together into something indescribable. Greta walked forward slowly, as if in a dream. She reached out and touched one of the wedding dresses, her fingers trembling against the silk. It was real, soft and cool and beautiful. She had been engaged once, before the war, to a young officer named Hans, who had died at Stalingrad. She had never worn a wedding dress. She had never stood in white lace before family and friends. That life had been stolen by the war. And now here in a prison camp in Mississippi, an American woman she would never meet had sent her a wedding dress. She pulled the dress close and buried her face in the fabric, weeping for Hans, for Germany, for all the lost years and broken dreams. Around her, other women were doing the same, each holding a dress like a talisman, each crying for different reasons, but united in their sorrow and surprise. In the days following the delivery, the camp transformed. The women moved through their routines with new energy, the dresses hanging in their barracks like promises of a different future. Some women tried theirs on immediately, standing before small mirrors and adjusting hems, admiring the way silk caught the light or how lace framed their faces. Others folded theirs carefully and stored them in their footlockers, too precious to wear, too meaningful to treat casually. The transformation was visible in small ways throughout the camp. Women who had shuffled through their days with empty eyes now walked with purpose. Conversations that had been dominated by worry and homesickness now included plans and dreams. In the evenings, instead of lying silently in their bunks, the women gathered in small groups to discuss their dresses, to share sewing tips, to imagine occasions when they might wear such beautiful things. One woman, Elizabeth, who had barely spoken since arriving at the camp, began to sing again. She had been an opera student in Berlin before the war. Her training interrupted when she was conscripted to work in a military communications office. Now, with a blue evening gown hanging above her bunk, she found her voice again. She sang German folk songs and arias from operas, her soprano voice filling the barracks with beauty. Other women would stop their activities to listen, transported by the music to memories of better times. The dresses also sparked unexpected creativity. Women who had never sewn before learned from those who had. They shared needles and thread, salvaged from work details or traded from the canteen. They experimented with alterations, transforming dresses that were too large or too small into perfect fits. Some women combined elements from multiple dresses, creating unique designs that reflected their personal styles. The barracks became workshops, filled with the quiet industry of women reclaiming agency over their appearance and their futures. For many, the act of preparing the dresses became a form of therapy. The concentration required to sew a straight seam, to attach a button, to adjust a hemline. These tasks provided escape from the constant worry about families back home and the uncertainty of what would happen next. The dresses gave them something positive to focus on, something beautiful in a world that had been dominated by ugliness and destruction for too long. The guards noticed the change. The women smiled more, talked more. There was laughter in the mess hall, conversation in the courtyard. A few women with sewing skills began altering dresses for others, taking in waists and hemming lengths. The barracks became impromptu tailoring shops, filled with the sound of needles threading and fabric rustling. It was as if the dresses had given them permission to think about life beyond the camp, beyond the war, beyond captivity. One woman, Ilse, a former nurse from Hamburg, organized a fashion show. It was a spontaneous idea, born from boredom and the desire to do something celebratory. On a Sunday afternoon, when work was light and the weather was warm, the women gathered in the recreation hall. Those who wanted to participate modeled their dresses, while others clapped and cheered. There were evening gowns and cocktail dresses, but the real stars were the wedding dresses. Each woman who wore one walked with a mixture of joy and sadness, embodying both the life she had lost and the life she hoped to reclaim. The fashion show took on a life of its own, becoming more elaborate than anyone had planned. Women created a makeshift runway using sheets laid on the floor. Others fashioned a curtain from blankets, behind which the models could prepare. Someone found an old gramophone in a storage room, and they played records of American big band music, the jazzy rhythms providing an incongruously cheerful soundtrack to their procession. Each woman who walked that makeshift runway carried her own story in the way she wore her dress. Margaret, the former propaganda clerk who had publicly acknowledged her mistakes, wore a simple cream-colored dress with pearl buttons. She walked with quiet dignity, her head high, as if the dress had given her permission to shed her shame and embrace a new identity. Ilse wore a navy blue evening gown with silver embroidery, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had saved lives and knew her worth, despite the uniform she had once worn. One young woman, barely 20, wore a wedding dress that was too large for her thin frame. She had altered it as best she could, but it still hung loosely on her shoulders. Yet she walked that runway with her head held high, tears streaming down her face, clutching a makeshift bouquet of wildflowers someone had gathered from outside the fence. Her fiancé had died at Monte Cassino, and she would never have the wedding they had planned. But for those few minutes, walking in that white dress, she could imagine it. She could pretend that somewhere, in some alternate version of reality, he was waiting for her at the end of that runway. The other women understood. They clapped and cheered, but many were crying too. Every dress represented a dream deferred, a future uncertain, a past that could never be reclaimed. Yet they were also celebrating resilience, the stubborn refusal to let war destroy everything, the determination to find beauty and joy even in the most unlikely circumstances. The guards watched from the doorway, moved by the scene despite themselves. One young soldier from Tennessee later wrote to his mother, "You should have seen them, Ma. They looked like regular girls, like Betty and Sue back home. They were laughing and crying and showing off dresses like it was prom night. Made me forget for a minute why they were here. Made me think about how war messes everything up for everybody." But joy in the camp existed alongside ongoing anguish. Letters from Germany continued to arrive, each one a reminder of the world outside the wire. Families were suffering. Cities remained in ruins. Food shortages persisted. People were dying from cold, hunger, disease. One woman received a letter from her sister describing how their mother had died that winter, too weak from malnutrition to fight off pneumonia. Another read about her hometown being divided between occupation zones, her family now living under Soviet control with no way to communicate freely. The letters arrived in batches, distributed during evening mail call. The women would gather anxiously, hoping for news from home while simultaneously dreading what that news might contain. Each envelope was handled with trembling fingers, each page read and reread until the paper grew soft from handling and tears. Some letters were so heavily censored that they made little sense, black lines obscuring crucial information. Others arrived water-damaged or torn, the words smudged but the desperation behind them still clear. One evening, a woman named Frida received a letter from her father. He wrote about their home in Hamburg, which had been destroyed in the firebombing of 1943. They were living in a basement with 6 other families, sharing one small stove for cooking and heat. He described searching for food in the rubble, finding nothing but scraps. He mentioned her younger brother, who had been wounded on the Eastern Front and returned home without his left arm, unable to work, another mouth to feed in a household with no resources. The letter ended with a simple plea. "If you have any food to spare, please send it. We are so hungry." Frida sat on her bunk, the letter shaking in her hands, and looked at the half-eaten chocolate bar on her footlocker. She had been saving it, rationing it out as a treat over several days. Now it seemed obscene, wasteful. Her family was starving, and she had chocolate, more chocolate than she could eat. She had 3 meals a day while her brother, a war veteran, went hungry. She had a warm bed while they shivered in a basement. The unfairness of it crushed her. She was not alone in this anguish. All around her, women were grappling with similar contradictions. They knew intellectually that their good treatment was the result of American adherence to the Geneva Convention, that they were lucky to be in American custody rather than Soviet, that being well-fed was better than being starved regardless of what was happening elsewhere. But emotions do not bow to logic. The guilt remained heavy and inescapable. Some women tried to send packages home, but regulations made it difficult and expensive. The items they could afford with their camp wages were limited, and shipping was unreliable. Most packages never arrived, lost in the chaos of a destroyed continent or stolen by desperate people along the way. The futility of their efforts only deepened their sense of helplessness. They could do nothing for their families except write letters full of empty reassurances and impossible hopes. The contrast was brutal. Here they were, wearing silk dresses and eating 3 meals a day. There their families were, scavenging for scraps and burning furniture for warmth. Greta wrote in her diary, "How can I wear a wedding dress when my mother is eating soup made from grass? How can I smile when my country is dying?" The Americans give us gifts, but every gift reminds us of what we have lost. Some women grew angry at the inequality. Why should they be comfortable while their loved ones suffered? Others felt profound guilt, as if accepting the dresses meant betraying their families. A few refused to try on the dresses at all, leaving them folded in their boxes as a form of protest against their own good fortune. Yet the dresses also became symbols of hope. If American women could be generous enough to send wedding dresses to enemy prisoners, then perhaps the world was not entirely broken. Perhaps humanity could survive even the worst war in history. Perhaps there was a future worth preparing for, even if that future seemed impossibly distant from the present reality of captivity and loss. As spring turned to summer, small moments of humanity bridged the gap between prisoners and guards. One afternoon, a guard named Sarah, a young woman from Georgia who worked in the camp's administrative office, approached Greta while she was sewing. Sarah had been watching the German women for months, initially with suspicion, then curiosity, and finally with something like sympathy. "May I see what you're working on?" Sarah asked in halting German. Greta looked up, surprised. American female guards were rare, and most kept their distance from the prisoners, but Sarah seemed genuinely interested, so Greta held up the dress she was altering. It was a simple blue evening gown, elegant but understated. "That's beautiful," Sarah said. She hesitated, then added, "I donated one of my sister's old bridesmaid dresses to the collection. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. Some people thought we shouldn't give you all anything. But my pastor said we should treat prisoners the way we'd want our boys treated if they were captured. I hope it helps." Greta felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she managed to say. "It helps more than you know." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the war shrinking to nothing between them, just 2 young women thinking about dresses and hope and the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. Other connections formed. A guard who played guitar sometimes performed for the women in the evening, folk songs that needed no translation. Women taught guards German songs in return, and the strange music filled the camp at dusk, a blend of cultures that war had tried to keep separate. In the kitchen, American cooks and German prisoners worked side by side, exchanging recipes and stories. Language barriers made communication difficult, but laughter and gestures bridged the gap. These moments did not erase the war or the suffering it had caused. They did not resolve the complex politics of guilt and responsibility, but they reminded everyone in the camp that underneath the uniforms and flags and national identities were simply people, trying to survive, trying to find meaning, trying to imagine a future beyond the conflict. As the months passed, the women began to wrestle with deeper questions. They had been raised in Nazi Germany, educated in its schools, shaped by its propaganda. They had been told that Germans were superior, that their cause was righteous, that their enemies were subhuman monsters. The war had shaken those beliefs, but captivity was demolishing them entirely. How could Americans be monsters when they fed their prisoners better than Germany had fed its own people? How could they be inferior when their country remained intact and prosperous while Germany lay in ruins? How could they be cruel when they sent wedding dresses to women they had every right to hate? Every act of kindness, every gesture of humanity, was a crack in the foundation of everything the women had been taught to believe. Greta wrote in her diary, "I am angry at my own leaders. They lied to us. They told us we were fighting for survival, but they were fighting for conquest. They told us the enemy was evil, but the enemy treats us with more dignity than our own government ever did. What does that make us? What does that make me?" Who believed them? Some women resisted this transformation. They clung to their old beliefs, insisting that the American kindness was a trick, a strategy to weaken their resolve. They argued that Germany had been fighting a defensive war, that the Allies were equally guilty of atrocities. But these arguments rang hollow in a camp where they were well-fed, well-housed, and given wedding dresses by women who owed them nothing. At night, the women debated in low voices, afraid the guards might overhear, afraid of what their words might mean. Were they betraying their country by accepting American generosity? Were they betraying themselves by refusing to acknowledge the truth? The conversations were painful, filled with tears and anger and confusion. These conversations happened in whispers after lights out, when darkness provided a kind of cover for dangerous truths. Women who had been strangers before the war, thrown together by circumstances beyond their control, became confidants and therapists for each other. They shared doubts they could never have voiced in Nazi Germany, where questioning the regime meant risking everything. Here in captivity, they could finally speak freely, though the freedom to speak truth came with the burden of facing that truth. Some of the younger women, those who had been children when Hitler rose to power, struggled most with this reckoning. They had never known any other system. The propaganda had been part of their education from the earliest years. One woman, barely 22, confessed that she did not know who she was without the ideology she had been taught. If everything she had learned was a lie, then what was true? What could she believe? These questions haunted her, left her feeling unmoored and lost. Others found the process of questioning almost liberating. For women who had harbored private doubts during the war but had been too afraid to voice them, the camp became a place where they could finally examine their beliefs honestly. They could admit that they had seen evidence of atrocities. They could acknowledge that the regime had been cruel not just to its enemies but to its own people. They could recognize that the grandiose promises of the 1,000-year Reich had been built on lies and maintained through terror. One evening, a woman named Margaret, who had been an ardent supporter of the Nazi regime, stood up in the barracks and spoke. She was older than most of the others, in her late 30s, and she had worked as a clerk in the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. Her husband had been a party official, killed in the bombing of Berlin. She had every reason to hate the Allies. "I was wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "We were all wrong. I believed the lies. I helped spread them. And now I see what they cost us. Look at us. We are alive because the enemy chose to be merciful. Our own leaders would have let us starve. They did let millions starve. We were expendable to them. But we mattered to these Americans, even though we were their enemies. What does that tell us about who we were fighting for?" Silence followed her words. Then slowly other women began to nod. Some wiped away tears. Others hugged Margaret, offering comfort and solidarity. It was a moment of collective awakening, painful but necessary. They were beginning to see the war clearly for the first time, stripped of propaganda and nationalism. And what they saw was tragedy, waste, lies. The women came to understand that the Americans had defeated them not just militarily but morally. The wedding dresses were not just gifts. They were proof of a different kind of society, one that valued individual dignity even in enemies. The Americans had won the war with bombs and bullets, but they were winning the peace with food and soap and dresses. It was a more devastating victory than any battlefield triumph. Greta wrote, "Cruelty would have been easier to bear. We could have clung to our hatred, our sense of righteousness, our belief that we were the victims. But kindness strips all that away. Kindness forces us to see our enemies as human, and once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Once you accept a gift from someone you were taught to hate, you have to question everything you were taught." The dresses became symbols of this transformation. Every time a woman looked at her dress, she was reminded that mercy was possible, that enemies could choose compassion over revenge, that the future did not have to repeat the past. The dresses represented not just weddings and celebrations, but the possibility of rebuilding, of starting over, of creating a world different from the one that had destroyed itself in war. Some women began to dream again. They talked about returning to Germany and rebuilding their country not as it had been, but as it should be. They imagined schools that taught truth instead of propaganda. They envisioned governments that served people instead of using them. They dared to hope that the next generation would not have to fight the same wars, make the same mistakes, suffer the same losses. The climax came in the late summer of 1946, when the camp held an actual wedding. Two prisoners, Greta and a German man named Karl, who was held in a nearby male POW camp, had fallen in love through a carefully monitored correspondence program. Karl had been a tank mechanic, captured in France in 1944. He was gentle and kind, nothing like the fanatics who had led Germany into disaster. When they asked permission to marry, the camp commanders from both facilities discussed it at length. There was no precedent for such a thing. Prisoners marrying in captivity? It seemed absurd, but both Greta and Karl had been model prisoners. They had worked hard, caused no trouble, and their love seemed genuine. Finally, the commanders agreed with one condition. The wedding would be held at Camp Como, with both sets of prisoners attending under heavy guard. The day of the wedding was bright and warm. Greta wore one of the donated wedding dresses, a beautiful gown of white satin with delicate lace sleeves. Other prisoners had helped her alter it to fit perfectly. They had made a veil from netting intended for mosquito protection. They had picked wildflowers from the area around the camp to make a bouquet. It was not the wedding Greta would have had in peacetime, but it was beautiful in its own way. The women had spent weeks preparing for the ceremony, pouring all their creative energy into making the day special. They transformed the recreation hall with decorations made from whatever materials they could find. Paper chains fashioned from old newspapers hung from the rafters. Wildflowers filled every available container, their colors bright against the plain wooden walls. Someone had painted a banner reading "Congratulations" in both German and English, the letters slightly crooked but heartfelt. Greta prepared in her barracks, surrounded by the other women who fussed over her like sisters. They styled her hair, pinning it up with makeshift hairpins crafted from wire. They applied a touch of rouge to her cheeks, borrowed from the single woman in the camp who had managed to buy cosmetics from the canteen. They adjusted her veil again and again until it fell just right. As they worked, they shared stories of their own weddings, or the weddings they had hoped to have, or the weddings they still dreamed of having someday. The room was filled with laughter and tears in equal measure. When Greta was finally ready, she stood before the small mirror in the barracks and barely recognized herself. She looked radiant, transformed. The dress fit as if it had been made for her. The veil softened her features. For a moment she allowed herself to forget where she was and why. For a moment she was just a bride on her wedding day, about to marry the man she loved. That moment was precious beyond words. Karl had arrived that morning with a group of male prisoners from the neighboring camp, all under heavy guard. He too had been prepared by his fellow prisoners, who had managed to find him a clean shirt and pressed trousers. Someone had even located a tie. He looked nervous and excited as he waited at the front of the hall, shifting his weight from foot to foot, smoothing his hair repeatedly with one hand. When Greta entered the hall, walking slowly down an aisle formed by rows of seated prisoners, Karl's face transformed. His eyes filled with tears and his hand went to his chest as if to still his racing heart. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he had imagined during all those months of letters and brief supervised visits. As she reached him and took his hand, he whispered in German, "You are my miracle." And she believed him because he was hers too. Proof that love could survive even the worst circumstances, that hope was not foolish even in the darkest times. The ceremony was performed by a Lutheran chaplain from a nearby American military base. He spoke in both German and English, blessing the Union and praying for peace. The prisoners, both male and female, attended in their best clothes. The guards stood at the perimeter, maintaining security, but also moved by the scene. Some of them had tears in their eyes. One guard later said, "It was the damnedest thing." Here we were, in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi, watching two German prisoners get married. And for a few minutes it felt like the war was really over. Like we could all move on. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. The camp kitchen had baked a cake, simple but sweet. Someone had found a record player and German music played softly. The prisoners danced, laughed, celebrated. For a few hours, they were not prisoners at all. They were just people, marking a moment of joy in the middle of sorrow, claiming hope in the face of despair. The cake was a wonder in itself. 3 layers with white frosting, decorated with more wildflowers pressed into the icing. The camp baker, an American corporal from Louisiana, had worked on it for 2 days, determined to create something worthy of the occasion. When it was wheeled out on a cart, the prisoners gasped. Many had not seen a proper wedding cake in years. Some had never seen one at all, coming from families too poor to afford such luxuries even before the war. Greta and Karl cut the cake together, their hands joined on the knife, following a tradition that transcended national boundaries. They fed each other small bites, smiling through their tears. Then pieces were distributed to everyone present, prisoners and guards alike. An American sergeant stood next to a German former soldier, both eating wedding cake, both watching the bride and groom with the same expression of bittersweet joy. The war had made them enemies, but this moment made them witnesses to something that war could not touch, the human need for love and celebration. The dancing began slowly. Someone had brought records of traditional German waltzes, and the first song that played was one that many recognized from their childhoods, Older. Women remembered dancing to it at their own weddings. Younger ones knew it from family gatherings before the world fell apart. As the music filled the hall, couples began to form, prisoners with prisoners, since guards maintained professional distance. But even the guards swayed slightly to the music, caught up in the emotion of the moment. Greta and Carl took the first dance, moving together with surprising grace despite having had no practice. They held each other close, her white dress swirling around them, his hand firm and steady on her waist. They spoke in whispers, words meant only for each other, making promises about a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. Other couples joined them, filling the floor with motion and life. Women danced with women when there were not enough male partners, laughing at the awkwardness, grateful for any excuse to move and celebrate. At one point, someone changed the record to an American swing number, and the mood shifted from bittersweet to almost joyful. A few of the younger prisoners had learned to dance to American music during their time in the camp, and they showed others the steps. Soon the hall was filled with the sound of laughter and the sight of women in donated dresses attempting to jitterbug, their movements clumsy but enthusiastic. Even some of the guards joined in, teaching dance steps across the language barrier, music becoming a bridge where words could not reach. Greta danced with Carl, her white dress swirling around her legs. She thought of Hans, her first love, dead in Russia. She thought of her mother back in Germany, probably still alive but struggling. She thought of all the years lost to war, all the dreams deferred, and then she looked at Carl's face, saw the love in his eyes, and allowed herself to believe that new dreams were possible. That night, back in the barracks, the women talked about the wedding long into the darkness. It had been proof that life continued, that love survived, that even in the strangest circumstances, beauty could emerge. The wedding dress, donated by an unknown American woman, had served its purpose. It had allowed Greta to marry, to claim a future, to believe again. In the autumn of 1946, repatriation began. The women were told they would be returning to Germany, back to the country they had left over a year earlier. The news was met with mixed emotions. They wanted to see their families, to return home, to reclaim their lives. But they also feared what they would find. Germany was occupied, divided, still in ruins. Food remained scarce. Infrastructure was destroyed. And they would be returning with memories of American abundance, of being treated well by their enemies, of wedding dresses and kindness. Many women worried about judgment. How would their families react to stories of good treatment? Would they be accused of collaboration, of enjoying comfort while others suffered? Some prisoners decided to downplay their experiences in America, to speak only of longing for home and hardship in captivity. Others resolved to tell the truth regardless of how it would be received. Greta faced a unique challenge. She was married now to Carl, and they wanted to stay together. But repatriation policies separated prisoners by gender and origin. Carl was from Bavaria, Greta from Prussia. They might be sent to different occupation zones with no way to reach each other. The uncertainty was agonizing. In the end, a sympathetic administrator arranged for them to be sent to the same displaced persons camp in the American zone. It was not ideal, but it was better than separation. They packed their few belongings, including the wedding dress carefully folded in a trunk. Other women packed their dresses too, determined to bring home something beautiful from this strange period of captivity. The journey back to Germany was long and uncomfortable. They traveled by train to New York, then by ship across the Atlantic. The Atlantic crossing was rougher than the journey west had been, and many women were seasick. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil. They were sailing toward an uncertain future in a broken country. When they arrived in Bremerhaven in November 1946, the contrast with their departure was stark. The port city was devastated. Buildings stood in ruins. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and haunted. The smell of destruction hung in the air. This was the Germany they had left, but seeing it again after months in America made it worse somehow. They had adjusted to abundance, to safety, to order. Now they were returning to chaos. The ship docked in cold November rain, and as the women descended the gangway with their belongings, they got their first close look at what had become of their homeland. The port area was a wasteland of twisted metal and collapsed buildings. Cranes stood frozen mid-operation, damaged beyond repair. Ships lay on their sides in the harbor, half submerged and rusting. Everywhere they looked, there was destruction. The people they saw were almost unrecognizable as their countrymen. Men and women in ragged clothes picked through rubble, searching for anything useful. A piece of wood for fuel, a scrap of metal to trade, perhaps something to eat. Children with stick-thin limbs and hollow eyes watched the disembarking prisoners with dull curiosity. Old people sat on piles of bricks that had once been their homes, staring at nothing, waiting for something that would never come. The air itself seemed heavy with despair. The displaced persons camp where Greta and Carl were sent was overcrowded and chaotic. Thousands of people, refugees, former prisoners of war, displaced persons from across Europe, lived in hastily constructed barracks or even in tents. Food was rationed strictly, and even those rations were barely adequate. The women from Camp Como, arriving with their carefully packed suitcases and relative health, stood out immediately. They were too well fed, too clean, too intact. It marked them as different, and not always in ways that made others kindly disposed toward them. Infrastructure was almost non-existent. There was no reliable electricity. Water came from communal pumps. Heating was minimal, and winter was approaching. Medical care was overwhelmed by the sheer number of sick and wounded. Every day brought new arrivals, more desperate people with nowhere else to go. The camp administrators did their best, but they were drowning in the scale of the catastrophe. Germany had not just lost the war, it had been broken into pieces, and no one was sure if those pieces could ever be put back together. Reunions with families were bittersweet. There was joy at being together again, but also shock at physical changes. The women were healthier than their families, better fed, stronger. This created uncomfortable silences, unspoken resentments. Some family members asked suspiciously, "What did you do to earn such treatment? Were you friendly with the Americans?" The implications stung. Greta reunited with her sister Anna in a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt. Anna was rail-thin, her clothes hanging off her frame, her face aged beyond her years. When she saw Greta, healthy and well-dressed, her first words were, "You look good, too good." Greta tried to explain about the camp, the food, the treatment, the wedding dresses, but Anna cut her off. "I don't want to hear about American generosity. I want to forget the Americans exist. They destroyed our city." The gulf between their experiences was unbridgeable at that moment. Anna had survived the bombing of Dresden, had seen things that Greta could not imagine. Greta had survived captivity, had learned things about their country and its enemies that Anna was not ready to hear. They loved each other, but understanding would take time. In the years that followed, the women who had been held at Camp Como scattered across Germany. They rebuilt their lives slowly, finding work, starting families, trying to forget the war. But the wedding dresses remained, stored in closets and trunks, physical reminders of a strange period when enemies had been kind. Some women wore their dresses for special occasions. A few even wore them for weddings, as they had been intended. Others gave them to their daughters, passing down not just fabric, but stories of survival and unexpected mercy. The dresses became family heirlooms, more valuable for their history than their material worth. Greta and Karl settled in Munich, where Karl found work as a mechanic and Greta as a secretary. They had 3 children and lived modestly but happily. Greta kept her diary and added to it over the years, recording not just the past, but her reflections on what it all meant. In one entry from 1965, she wrote, 20 years have passed since the war ended. My children are growing up in a different Germany, one that has learned hard lessons about what happens when people follow fanatics. I tell them about Camp Como sometimes, about the wedding dresses, about how Americans treated us better than we deserved. They find it hard to believe, which I understand. It was hard to believe even while it was happening. But those dresses taught me something important, that mercy is more powerful than revenge, that kindness can change hearts in ways that violence never can, and that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose to do good when they could easily choose otherwise. That lesson stayed with her throughout her life. When she died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell, her wedding dress was still carefully preserved in her closet. Her daughter donated it to a museum dedicated to World War II history, where it remains today, a silent witness to a moment when humanity triumphed over hate. And so the wedding dresses became more than clothing. They became symbols of an extraordinary moment in history when enemies chose compassion over cruelty, when women on opposite sides of a war reached across that divide with gifts of beauty and hope. For those German prisoners standing in that Mississippi courtyard expecting execution and receiving wedding dresses instead, the experience shattered everything they had been taught to believe. The paradox was almost unbearable. To be treated with dignity by those you had been told were monsters, to be given gifts by those you had fought against, to discover that your own government had lied to you while your enemies told you the truth. But from that unbearable paradox came transformation. The women learned that humanity could survive even the worst war, that individuals could choose kindness even when nations chose violence, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hate is simply decency. As Greta told her granddaughter many years later, we expected death and received life. We expected punishment and received gifts. We expected to be treated as the enemy, and instead we were treated as human beings. That is what I remember most about America. Not the food or the comfortable beds or even the wedding dresses, though all of those mattered. What I remember most is that they chose to see us as people, not as symbols of a regime we had served but did not create. That choice changed me. It made me believe that people are capable of choosing better, even after the worst. That is the story worth remembering. In a time of hatred and violence, some people chose mercy. In a time of division, some people chose connection. And sometimes the smallest gestures, a donated dress, a kind word, a moment of recognition that we are all human underneath our uniforms and nationalities, matter more than grand political statements or military victories. The wedding dresses of Camp Como remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, light can find a way through. That redemption is possible, that enemies can become, if not friends, then at least human beings worthy of dignity and respect, and that the choices we make in how we treat others, especially those we have power over, define us more than any victory or defeat ever could. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more incredible true accounts from World War II history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today about courage, compassion, and the complexity of the human heart in times of war. Thank you for watching.